Hey there. Tonight, we're not heading back to kings or knights, but instead to the other side of history, the side without luxury, without honor, and without a warm bed to collapse into. This is the story of an ordinary medieval peasant's entire life. From the moment you're born into straw and smoke, until the day you're lowered into the frozen ground, forgotten by the world, but remembered by the few who lived beside you. You'll grow up hungry, work until your bones throb, and face winters, famines, fevers, and the constant eye of the church. But along that path, there's also laughter, stubborn hope, and fleeting moments of peace. If these quiet journeys through history help you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you comfort. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something oddly calming about seeing people drifting off to the same story all over the world. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background. Settle in, and let's begin with the very first chapter of a peasant's life. They say I entered this world on a cold morning in late November. Not that calendars meant much in our little village, unless it was planning time or a saint's feast. My mother delivered me on a bed of straw near the hearth, while my eldest sister threw more dung onto the fire. My father muttered something about another mouth to feed. It was my third sister who cut the cord with the same knife we usually used for cheese. Then I was wrapped in ragged cloths that once belonged to a cousin who hadn't lived long, like most cousins didn't. There wasn't anything grand about it, just another baby in a smoky hut already echoing with coughs, sneezes, and too many bodies crammed into too little space. You don't get a name straight away. That was superstition. Many babies didn't survive more than a few weeks, and people thought it was bad luck to get attached too soon. Almost every family had buried an infant at some point, and the churchyard was dotted with tiny, unmarked graves, soft soil covering short lives. So they waited, they watched, and only after I survived my first fever was I baptized by Father Oswin in a cold stone font that smelled faintly of mildew and sheep's wool. I don't remember it, of course, but I do remember him years later, crooked nose, sour breath, and a stare sharp enough to curdle milk. They named me Thomas, after an uncle who'd once been kicked by a mule and died half an hour later. Names usually came from saints or dead relatives, sometimes both. My first bed was a rough wooden cradle stuffed with hay and lined with worn cloth. It sat near the fire if we had one going, or next to the ashes if we didn't. Our house, if you could call it that, was made of timber, wattle, and daub, with a thatched roof that leaked any time the rain was heavier than a drizzle, which in England was most days. The floor was bare earth, real dirt. We swept it now and then with a bundle of twigs, usually only after someone had stepped in something that shouldn't have been dragged inside in the first place. Chickens wandered in and out of the house like they owned the place, and a pig often curled up near my cradle for warmth. Truth be told, she smelled better than most of my siblings. We had no chimney, just a hole in the roof and a prayer that the smoke would drift upward instead of sideways. It rarely did. Everything, our clothes, our hair, even our skin, carried that heavy reek of smoke, the kind of smell that seeps into your bones and never really leaves. As a baby, I was lucky enough to have milk. Some weren't so fortunate. Wet nurses were a rare luxury, so most mothers fed their own children if they had anything to spare. My mother did her best, even with 5 other hungry mouths to feed and a winter ration of pottage that barely covered the bottom of a spoon. When weaning time came, it meant mashed peas, softened barley, or scraps of bread soaked in broth. Teeth arrived early. Illness arrived earlier. I had 4 siblings older than me, 2 younger, and one I never met. He died quietly in the night around Candlemas, wrapped in a blanket, still warm when they found him. No one spoke about it. They didn't need to. Everyone understood. By the time I could walk, I already had chores. Childhood wasn't what people today imagine. There were no toys, no schools, no idle afternoons spent discovering yourself. My earliest years were spent chasing after chickens, hauling water from the stream, which might or might not have had a dead squirrel floating in it, and getting swatted with a wooden spoon if I got underfoot. We shared everything: beds, shoes, illnesses. My sister and I rotated the same tunic week by week. It never fully dried between uses. Lice were ordinary, fleas expected, worms, well, you only bothered mentioning them if one actually wriggled up into your throat. By 6 or 7, my responsibilities had grown. That's about the age when you're considered halfway useful. I helped muck out the stalls, scared crows from the fields, and lugged baskets of turnips so heavy I could barely see over them. My hands were calloused long before I ever held a quill, not that I ever would. Some children in towns or wealthy manors were apprenticed or sent to monasteries, not me. My path was the fields, just like my father, and his father before him, back when most of England was still forest and people half expected Vikings to appear on a Tuesday. Life for peasants moved to the rhythm of the seasons. Spring meant sowing, summer was for tending. Autumn brought the harvest, winter was about surviving. Simple. But even as a child, you noticed things. The way the whole village seemed to hold its breath during childbirth. The way neighbors crossed themselves twice when smoke from a chimney looked too thin. The way old men stared at the horizon as though waiting for something bad to arrive, and often it did. Still, we played. Children always do. We made games from sticks and stones, raced each other barefoot, and fought mock battles with straw swords. We laughed, skinned our knees, and squabbled like dogs over the last apple left on the tree. But even in those moments of play, there was always work waiting. Work never stopped. Sometimes, when Father Oswin wasn't watching, we'd slip into the chapel just to press our hands against the cool stone and stare at the candles burning. It felt almost magical, like mud couldn't follow you inside, and even the quietest whisper carried itself upward like a prayer. I didn't understand Latin, but I understood silence and how rare it was. There was a boy named Will who lived just 2 houses down. He'd lost 3 brothers to fever, and he used to say that if you saw 3 crows in the field before breakfast, someone would be dead before sundown. We all believed him. Superstition wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Saints guarded our animals. Relics were said to cure our boils, and dreams. Dreams were warnings, especially the ones that burned with fire. My education came from stories, prayers, and curses. I learned which crops to plant and when. I learned how to spot a snake rustling through tall grass. I learned that if you stepped onto the church threshold with your left foot first, you'd be doomed to a week of bad luck. These were the lessons that mattered. Latin could wait. Still, even through the muck and the hardship, there were moments, bright ones. Days when the barley stood tall and the wind carried the smell of the sun. Nights when someone brewed ale strong enough to warm your belly, and laughter floated across the village like music. Feasts were rare, but when they came, the whole community gathered, no matter how small the spread. Someone would pull out a fiddle, or a neighbor would tell a story so good, even the pigs stopped grunting to listen. That was childhood for us, a strange mixture of hunger, noise, hard work, and short-lived joys. We were never clean, rarely full, often cold, but we were alive, and in those years, that felt like victory enough. If I close my eyes, I can still smell the hearth smoke. I can feel the straw poking through my bedding. I can hear my mother humming that same wordless tune every evening. Something soft, something simple, like a lullaby woven out of endurance. They say a man is shaped by his earliest years. If that's true, then I was shaped by mud, by ash, by the sound of my name being called for chores, shaped by the quiet truth that nothing in life, not warmth, not food, not even love, came without effort, but I survived. And for a medieval peasant child, that alone was more than most could hope for. They say a child's first memory lasts forever. Mine, a splinter, not a grand one, just a nasty sliver of wood I got from falling on a threshing floor while chasing a chicken. I howled, of course, not because it hurt all that much, but because I was 5, tired, and already smeared in half a day's worth of mud. My mother yanked the splinter out with her teeth, then shoved a crust of bread into my hand. It was so tough, even a dog would have turned it down. But that was comfort in our house. Removal of wood followed big carbohydrates. In medieval England, childhood wasn't a safe, protected stage. It was a short, muddy ramp leading straight into full exhaustion. You weren't coddled. You learned by watching, by copying, and by getting smacked with a ladle when you did something particularly foolish. I can't remember a time without work. By the time I could string a sentence together, I was already carrying water, a little bucket, sloshing down my legs as I waddled home. By 5, I was feeding chickens. By 6, I was scaring crows off the barley. By 7, I was sent off with the other boys to master the fine skill of not standing in the exact spot where the oxen needed to walk. We called it learning. Today, you'd probably call it survival training. Nearly every hour of the day revolved around the house and the fields. Mornings began before the sun had even thought about rising. During harvest season, it wasn't roosters that woke us. It was the sound of my father's boots slamming the door shut as he headed out ahead of everyone else. Breakfast was usually cold pottage, or maybe a scrap of bread if the rats hadn't beaten us to it. Nobody asked how you slept. Nobody cared. The day didn't wait for dreams. We didn't have toys, at least not the kind you'd buy or carve out of wood. A stick could become a sword, a spear, or even a horse, depending on how you swung it. Stones doubled as game pieces, tools, or projectiles. We played when we could, but always with one ear listening for an adult shouting our name. Or worse, our full name. That always meant trouble. There were no schools for children like us. Education, if you happened to stumble into it, came from a priest with a spare moment between funerals, or from an elder willing to share which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. The most I ever learned to write was the first letter of my name, scratched into the dirt with a twig. Even that seemed a bit too fancy for a boy like me. What I did learn quickly was everything needed to stay alive and, when possible, stay out of trouble. How to walk behind a plow without tripping, how to lift with your knees, how to spot a weasel in the chicken pen, how to keep silent when Father Oswin started preaching about sin and hellfire, and most importantly, how to pretend you weren't the one who stole the last apple from the cart. Religion found you early. You didn't understand it, not really. But you understood fear. You feared hell. You feared the devil. And you definitely feared Agnes, the woman 2 houses down, who had a way of looking at you sideways that made you think she'd cursed your sister's goat. God, too, you feared, but he was harder to picture. The priest painted him with fire, guilt, and silence. So we nodded along, wide-eyed, fingers crossed, hoping it was enough. By around 7, everything shifted. That was the age you stopped being treated like a child and started being treated like a very small adult. Your chores weren't pretend anymore. You were expected to actually help in the fields. If you were a girl, that meant endless washing, spinning, cooking. If you were a boy, you joined your father or brothers with the animals and tools. If you were especially unlucky, you did both. My father liked to say, a boy's hands should be blistered by 8. Mine were. By then, I'd already dropped a bucket on my toe, lost 2 fingernails to a millstone, and been kicked straight into a puddle by a cow who apparently didn't care for my face. Welcome to childhood. We were always outdoors, whether in the rain, the frost, or under the heavy heat of summer. There was no such thing as too cold or too hot when the barley needed tending, or when the sheep had wandered into someone else's pasture. I knew every stone and hollow on the path to the well, every splinter of the stable gate, every wormhole in the timber near the hearth. We lived close to the earth, not because we chose to, but because it made up our floors, our walls, our food, and half our illnesses. Sickness came often. Rashes, fevers, boils, you name it. Most things weren't even named. You just got the sweats, or the shakes, or that rattling cough, and you either recovered or you didn't. The village midwife, who also knew her herbs, helped where she could. But if the sickness was serious, your best hope was prayer, or luck, or both. Death was never an abstract idea. I once saw a friend of mine, 𝙔𝙤𝙪𝙧, go from laughing over a beetle to shivering under a blanket to being buried behind the chapel, all in 3 days. No one explained why. They just said, God took him, and we moved on, because we had to. Still, there was fun to be found in strange corners of life. We splashed in a stream. We pelted each other with snow or straw. We ran barefoot through the fields, yelping when we stepped on thorns, or startled frogs from their hiding spots. We stole turnips, then bolted when the tanner claimed they were his. At night, we gathered around the fire to listen to the old men's stories, tales of beasts, saints, and wars we didn't understand, but loved all the same. Life moved to a rhythm. You woke, you worked, you ate, you scratched, you slept, and sometimes you dreamed. Maybe of a better pair of shoes, or just a tunic that didn't itch. Even as children, we knew what the future held. You'd grow taller, never taller than the Lord's Son, of course, but tall enough to carry heavier loads. You'd marry, most likely a girl from the same village, with the same dirt under her fingernails. You'd have children who would live just as you did, and you'd die within a mile of where you were born. Nobody said this out loud, but it was in the way people looked at you, in the way they measured your height against the door frame, nodding as if to say, a few more years and he'll be useful. Childhood wasn't about wonder. It was about waiting until you were old enough to matter. On feast days, though, those were different. Saints' days or weddings brought food, music, even a little dancing. I still remember the taste of a honeyed oat cake I had once, and one year they roasted an entire pig. It felt like a miracle, meat that wasn't dried, boiled, or questionable. That night we ran wild, bellies full, hearts light. For a brief while, It felt like the village belonged to us, the children, as if, just for one evening, the future was something worth looking forward to. But dawn always came, and with it, the chores, the weight of firewood across your back, the sour smell of the sheep pen, the clang of the bucket against the well's stone wall. Back to the cycle, back to the growing. By the time I was 10, I could drive a cart, gut a fish, spin rope, and patch a broken fence. I could tell when rain was coming by the scent of the wind, and I could read my father's mood by the way he shut the door. By 12, I was, for all intents and purposes, nearly grown. At that age, you weren't a child anymore, not in the eyes of the village, the church, or even your own aching bones. You were a working man, a small one perhaps, but expected to carry your share of the load. Childhood ended not with a celebration or a speech, but with a longer list of chores, and the quiet realization that from here on out, the only real difference between you and your father was how much your back hurt. But I survived those years. I didn't freeze. I didn't starve. I didn't tumble into the well or get crushed beneath the oxen. I lived long enough for people to stop calling me boy and start asking me to haul heavier things. And if that isn't success in medieval England, I don't know what is. By 13, I had given up asking questions and started collecting blisters instead. That was the age a boy stopped being a boy. There was no ceremony for it, no candlelit moment, no sword pressed into your hand. One day you were helping in the fields, the next you were in them all day, every day. Sunrise to sundown. Stomach rumbling, back bent, eyes stinging from the wind, while last night's smoke still clung to your tunic. My voice had begun cracking like the rafters of our cottage after a heavy rain, and the older men noticed. They spoke to me less like a child and more like a colleague, an unimpressive one. You missed a row, Thomas. That plow line's crooked, Thomas. Stop walking like your legs are made of porridge, Thomas. Inspiring words, truly. Still, there was pride in it. I had a tool of my own now, a scythe, duller than it should have been, but mine. I was trusted to feed the animals, to turn the soil, even to collect deliveries from the manor's storehouse, assuming the steward wasn't in one of his foul moods. I earned my bread quite literally, and I ate it with the dignity of someone who'd bled for it. Work, like everything else, came in seasons. Spring meant plowing and sowing, boots heavy with mud, hands raw from gripping the handles. Summer brought endless days beneath a wide, glaring sky, your neck blistered, your eyes narrowed against the sun, swatting flies with every breath. Harvest was its own kind of madness. No sleep, no rest, just reaping until your arms felt like they belonged to someone else. And winter was when you wondered if your toes were still truly part of you. Food didn't improve with age, either. If anything, I grew more aware of how often we went without. Dinner might be a ladle of barley stew, chewy with scraps of old bone. Supper, if it existed at all, was cold, bread hardened by the hearth. I once cracked a tooth trying to bite through it. We laughed, then cried a little, because that was the last loaf. Water, fetched by my younger brother, still came from the stream or the communal well, depending on which was less cursed that week. It always tasted faintly of moss and worry, but we drank it anyway, unless there was beer. The older I grew, the more I began to notice the things men didn't speak of, but silently understood. The way they glanced at the sky and frowned. The way they listened to the hens clucking, as if it meant something, and it did. Bad luck had a way of drifting into the village, like a draft through a cracked door, Sometimes it was a fever, sometimes a cartwheel breaking at the worst possible moment. Once it was a roof collapsing in the night. By morning, 2 of our neighbors were gone. I helped pull their bodies from the rubble. They didn't look peaceful. They looked surprised, like even in a world where death was common, they hadn't expected that. Around that time, I started noticing girls, the way they carried water with one hand while tucking their hair with the other, the way they laughed even when their shoes were soaked and their fingers raw from scrubbing linens, the way their eyes shifted when the steward passed by. There was one girl, Ellsworth, who lived near the mill. She always smelled faintly of flour. Once, she slipped me an extra slice of apple when I looked pale. I never knew if she fancied me or just pitied me. Either way, I thought about that apple for weeks, but courtship wasn't candlelight and poetry. It was side glances while shoveling manure, maybe a shared song during harvest. If you were lucky, you might sit beside her at a feast. And if things truly went well, you asked her father or the reeve for permission to wed. Love was optional. Land was essential. I wasn't ready for marriage yet. I didn't even own a second tunic, but I was old enough to be expected to work not just for my family, but for the manor. Every peasant owed labor to the Lord. No pay, no choice. You showed up, did your part, and tried not to collapse until the job was finished. I remember one summer hauling stones for a wall around the Lord's herb garden. My back ached for a week, and I don't even like herbs. By then, I'd also learned to keep quiet around authority. You didn't question the reeve, you didn't question the steward, and you certainly didn't question the Lord, even if his velvet hat made him look like a goose in disguise. Religion, too, took a stronger hold as I grew older. I was finally old enough to follow the sermons, or at least pretend to. We knelt through Mass, muttered Latin none of us understood, crossed ourselves, and hoped it was enough. I confessed to sins I wasn't even sure counted, coveting bread, speaking ill of the hay fork, once kicking a chicken because it startled me. Father Oswin told me to pray harder. I tried, but more often than not, I fell asleep mid-prayer, worn down by work, by cold, by the quiet knowledge that nothing was guaranteed, not food, not health, not tomorrow. The manorial court became familiar too. Every few weeks, the villagers gathered while the Lord or his judge settled disputes, arguments over boundary lines, livestock quarrels, accusations of theft. Once, I watched a man fined for taking firewood from the wrong grove. Another man was whipped once for hunting rabbits that technically belonged to the Lord. I watched. I learned. I kept my head down. Sometimes I dreamed of leaving the village, running off to a town, finding work as a tanner, a miller, maybe even a guard. But those were the kinds of stories you told yourself when the rain wouldn't let you sleep, or when you were ankle-deep in manure and wondering if this was all life had to offer. And then I'd look around, at my brothers, at my mother by the hearth, at my father snoring in the corner, at the pig asleep in her usual spot. And I'd remember this was life, and it wasn't all bad. We had music sometimes, a fiddle, a pipe, a voice raised in song on a rare evening when the work was finished early and the ale hadn't yet run dry. We had stories, whispered and handed down by candlelight. We had the rhythm of the seasons, the first shoots of spring, the golden sheaves of harvest, the deep hush of snow in winter. And that was childhood in medieval England. No fairy tales, no soft edges, just mud, work, hunger, and the rare sparks of joy that kept us going. If you survived it, you carried those lessons for life. Lessons written not in books, but in calloused hands, empty bowls, and the quiet strength of simply enduring. So the next time you picture the Middle Ages, don't just think of knights and castles. Remember the children in the fields, barefoot in the frost, chasing chickens, dreaming of honeyed oat cakes, and learning far too early that nothing came without work. That was my childhood, hard, fleeting, and real, and somehow it was enough.